Madam President, distinguished delegates, the delegation of Eritrea has the honor to take the floor on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. Madam President, the unjust and abusive blockade against Cuba constitutes, without a doubt, one of the most serious, prolonged, and systematic violations of international law and of the Charter of the United Nations. It goes not only against the purpose and principles of this organization, but also against international human rights law, as the blockade is a form of collective punishment on the Cuban population. The General Assembly of the United Nations has demanded consistently and overwhelmingly during the past 3 decades the end of the blockade against Cuba. However, the effects of this policy on the Cuban people have just been strengthened in recent years to decimate the Cuban revolution. More than 30 resolutions approved by the General Assembly have not been enough for the removal of the blockade. The message has been clear. Throughout these 3 decades, the Cuban people have the right to build their own future free from any kind of interferences or pressures. Every day the blockade continues to exist represents a shame on the moral authority of this organization, a shame on the purpose and principles of the UN Charter, and a shame for multilateralism itself. The blockade against Cuba, in addition to being morally and politically unacceptable, by attempting to subjugate a small, peaceful, and supportive country by means of extreme pressures, transgresses the very foundation of this organization. Madam President, Article 1 of the UN Charter states, as one of its purposes, I quote, to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, end of quote. However, the blockade not only violates the right of Cubans to conduct their affairs in a sovereign manner without interference, but also restricts other states of the world from freely developing their economic and commercial ties with Cuba. Any nation in the world, rich or poor, is exposed to reprisals by the U.S. authorities if it maintains economic relations with Cuba. This punitive and extraterritorial nature of the blockade has been reinforced as never before after the full application of the Title III of the Helms-Burton Act in May 2019, which has opened up the possibility of filing lawsuits in U.S. courts against international companies operating with properties nationalized by the Cuban state. Being a fundamental piece in the declared purpose of successive governments of the United States of America to undermine the social project of the Cuban Revolution, the blockade threatens the political independence of Cuba, which is contrary to what is advocated in Article 2 of the UN Charter on relations among the members of the organization. Madam President, the arbitrary inclusion of Cuba in the illegal and unilateral list of countries falsely accused of sponsoring terrorism, fabricated by the U.S. government, is one of the biggest calumnies that have ever been set on any nation to curtail its stability. This is simply an absurd rhetoric. Cuba exports solidarity, not violence. This is one of the most harmful measures enforced to multiply the perverse effects of the blockade. Because of this labeling, Cuba has encountered even harder challenges to carry out international banking transactions, receive investments, or apply for credits. This has even provoked the closure of bank accounts to many Cuban diplomatic missions across the world, in violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. This measure has also served as a pretext to intimidate and cut tourism to Cuba, which is one of the country's main sources of income. Therefore, we call on the immediate removal of Cuba from this arbitrary and unilateral list, where it should never have been included in the first place, and which we firmly reject in its entirety. Madam President, since 1963, Cuba has been showing to the world the true meaning of both solidarity and cooperation by sending countless medical brigades to communities in need, as we all saw, for instance, during the largest pandemic our generations have witnessed, in which, despite all external aggressions, Cuba managed to develop various national vaccines against the coronavirus, which is then put to the service of humanity. Cuba has also welcomed in its own territory thousands of young people that go there to become professionals, so needed in their homelands, particularly in the healthcare field. We therefore denounce a dishonest campaign unleashed by the government of the United States of America to discredit Cuba international medical cooperation and to exert pressure on recipient governments, particularly on those from developing countries, thereby diminishing the commendable work undertaken by Cuban medical personnel in saving lives around the world. In this context, we express our deep appreciation, gratitude, and recognition to the Cuban health professionals who have provided high-quality health care to millions of people around the world, while calling on the U.S. government to put an end to their coercive, hostile, and blackmail practices and policies. The world needs more solidarity, not more blockade. Madam President, year after year, the report of the Secretary General presented to this body under this agenda item illustrates the numerous and sensitive negative impacts caused by the blockade of the Cuban population. There are children and young people who suffer from these impacts, mothers and the elderly who live in deprivation and are victims of a harmful and inhumane blockade driven by political motivations. Madam President, Article 13 of the UN Charter confers on this General Assembly, among its functions and powers, the promotion of international cooperation in the economic, social, cultural, educational, and health fields. Given that the blockade against Cuba is a major impediment to the achievement of this objective, as well as an obstacle to increasing the valuable contributions that Cuba can make to international cooperation, the General Assembly will continue to fall short in the effective realization of its functions until this harmful policy is eliminated. To conclude, Madam President, we express our solidarity with the people and government of Cuba. We demand the immediate and unconditional end of the blockade, and we call upon all member states of the organization to support once again the draft resolution to be submitted by the Cuban delegation under this agenda item. I thank you, Madam President.